Officially up to my most engaged tweet in months.
All right. Welcome to the Defiant Takes Football Show. Feels good to say that for the first time. We're officially rebranded, starting our own thing. I'm Max Dean. You can find me on Twitter at @TheMaxDean. I'm here with Nick Merriam, and we are going to talk about all of the non-playoff teams. We're going to do a little post-mortem, dissect what went wrong, and talk about what they have available to them going forward. So we're going to try and keep this moving at a nice clip since there's quite a few teams. And I think we're going to get started pretty quickly here. But Nick, how you doing today, man?
Doing well. I'm really excited for the playoffs, and we're very close. These weeks just fly by at the end of the season. It's a little disappointing, honestly, because it's about to be over. Really, we have a month left, but this is always the most fun part of the year. We get some really good football, so I'm excited for it.
Yeah, man. So when I get about halfway through the season, around week 8, I'm like, all right, I'm ready for playoff football. And then I'm just waiting for playoff football. And then when it finally gets here, I'm like, oh, that means there's so little football left. So
yeah,
but it's okay.
I think the first 8 weeks go by pretty quickly, and then the next 10, it's kind of it takes a while. I think the playoff race really drags out, and then the playoffs just are gone in an instant, because I think it's the excitement of the beginning of the season makes it fly by, and then the excitement of the playoffs with it being shorter makes it fly by as well. When you really get into week 10 and you start seeing some of these games where it's oh, the 4 and 5 Panthers are playing the 2 and 7. I don't know, it's some other bad team. That it can get a little slow at times when you have to talk about those games, but we've got
for sure. And it's also even the good teams when they play the bad teams, you know what I mean? You wait for those marquee matchups, you know what I mean, and you try and cherry pick, but yeah, no, I feel you. But we also will have the draft coming up, which is almost as much fun as the regular season, if I'm being honest. The only truly slow, brutal time in football really is that time about a few weeks after the draft. So you've already had all the conversations that you can about what happened in the draft, and then you're still just hanging out waiting for training camp to start. That's the killer time. That's it.
Yeah.
But we'll find some good content. All right. Let's see. Let's jump right in. We're going to go in draft order and have some. Let's do it this way. We're going to go in draft order, and we have a few little visual aids here. Okay, so for the first team we're going to look at, the Chicago Bears, they do have the first overall pick. What you see in the banner, that's their projected cap space approximately via overthecap.com, and then all of their draft picks and the roster that they have. So starting on offense, like I said, we're going to move fairly quickly through this. But Nick, what were your takeaways on what went wrong with the Bears season? And of course, I don't know if it was something that went wrong this year. There's kind of a build-up to get to this point, clearly. But if you have something concise, what would it be?
Well, it's kind of funny because what we said probably preseason went wrong did, and it almost went better than you would have expected in that. They just didn't add enough offensively in the offseason to really support Justin Fields. And they're a little bit lucky because some of these lower-end talents they brought in, fifth-round picks on the offensive line did end up working out. Braxton Jones, Larry Borum, and it gave them a great running game at times this season. It just didn't translate into the passing game because they don't have the weapons throwing the football to really do that yet. And so we're still kind of sitting here wondering about that defensively. Obviously, they added a couple players, I think, in the draft that were good, but didn't transform that unit either. But really, it's still the question of going into the offseason of you need to add weapons for Justin Fields. It didn't last year, and it showed up again this season.
Yeah, I think the weapons were a big part of it. They decided they wanted to focus on defense first. And I don't know if that was a decision initially, or it really just came down to who was available in the draft, because they really didn't want to spend much money. What little money they did spend, they did tend to designate toward the defense. Larry Ogunjobi was the one guy they really went after. And then when it came to the draft, they spent most of their high picks on defensive players, along with Velus Jones Jr. So looking at the defense a little bit here, they set themselves up for a pretty disappointing season. I did pick them to have the first overall draft pick prior to the season in our little predictions segment, and Justin Fields did turn out better than I anticipated, at least in terms of running. And he definitely still has those flash plays, but there's just not enough on the roster, and it's just not even close. I think, there's not much else to say about these guys because they have their work cut out for them. They know what they need to do. They have a decent number of draft picks. The fact that they have first overall makes it interesting because they can trade that for a haul. For sure, somebody will go up and use that pick in this draft, but they also could consider taking another quarterback and trading or retaining Justin Fields, depending. I mean, I don't think that's as crazy as the average Bear fan would probably tell you.
Yeah, and I mean, defensively, like the focus early on, obviously they didn't have first round pick. That helped them get Fields, and I think just a side note, like with that, it's a little bit of a difficult situation when you bring in a GM and the previous regime has drafted a quarterback the year before. This kind of happened with Washington with Dwayne Haskins. It's just like we don't really know how much this current management group likes Justin Fields. It sounds like they are at least liked him well enough to consider him as an option going forward, which, I think most fans would think he's definitely the option going forward just because it's kind of weird to like draft another quarterback and trade him. But we don't really know how hitched to that wagon they are. And so we kind of question that even more when they start out the draft going cornerback, safety with their 2 second-round picks. And then I think really the problem with that is that they could have kind of gotten creative with what they did in the 3rd round here, and they ended up taking Velus Jones, who I thought was an interesting prospect. Did not think he should have touched day 2 at all. He ran in the 4.3s, and that was kind of the extent of his playing style, is that he was just this kind of fast player who was good after the catch. And the majority of his production this year for Chicago was on screen passes, kick returns, and end arounds. They really weren't able to use this guy as like a full receiving threat. He more really just filled the Jakeem Grant role. And that's not good for a 3rd round selection that ends up being your like effectively biggest offensive addition you made in an offseason for a young quarterback. And it's interesting because like we talk so often, this is really, really, we're in the thick of, you have to prioritize quarterback and then support him with players. And if you don't, like, people will point to the Sam Darnold Jets situation, and people will say, like, you failed your quarterback and he never got to develop. And so the discussions going forward with Fields are going to be, look, this guy kind of figured it out, despite the fact that Chicago really didn't go out of their way to give him much of anything. And the fact that he's done anything, is it worth something? I don't know, because we're still having arguments about whether he has shown signs of passing ability that can develop beyond just being like a play action player who's a run first player. But to be honest with you, it's just, it would have been, I mean, obviously like they panicked a little bit midseason. They traded effectively a late 1st round pick for Chase Claypool, and that didn't really do anything for them either. So, they're missing the 32nd pick now because of that. It's interesting because I heard so many good things about this management group coming in, and I still believe they're probably going to do some good things this offseason. But there was a strong mixture of, it seemed that they didn't want to commit to a lot of players early, save assets, and really do a lot this offseason, but then also not necessarily panic moves, but just like we have to do something now moves where they go out of their way to make a decision that maybe wasn't the best.
Yeah, I mean, my interpretation is that they ended up liking Justin Fields more than they thought they would, because their moves really did indicate that we're not. I mean, there is a difference between making relatively low investment and making no investment. And they made no investment into his future, which is why they ended up making that move partway through the year. And so, he's an incredible runner. He has great size, better size than Lamar Jackson. He can still get beat up if you try and use him exclusively that way. he's got to develop as a passer, and this is a big decision for them. And I will talk about this more because it's a lengthy one, but this will be a key moment in the trajectory of their franchise. So I think they need to really know what they want to do. They need to know. They can't do what they feel they should do. They need to know what they want to do. But,
and I think this is, I just really quick before we move on, because I do want to move on, but I think this is a problem that teams are like getting to, where you need to come in with an idea of your commitment to players early. You can't do this wishy-washy, we don't know thing, because now the decision they have on their hands between Fields and Bryce Young, like I normally feel very strong about things in the NFL, like what teams should do. I have no idea what they should do. And so I know for a fact that they're struggling with this decision.
Well, I mean, I feel like I know what they should do, but again, we'll talk about that later.
I mean, maybe we do know, but maybe I'm just like in denial about it. Yeah.
All right. So next up, we have the Houston Texans, who now have the second overall pick after Week 18. Move on here to Texans here. Now, I'll throw it to you, Nick. What was, I mean, again, they had their work cut out for them. I think a couple of these top teams in the draft order, we really knew what we could basically expect out of them. But, you know, what would you say in a nutshell is the biggest issue with this roster?
So I actually don't think there's anything wrong with this roster. I think that the roster's been managed very well. I think the biggest issue that their management group made these last 2 years is hiring coaches that had no chances of coming back. Because what that did was effectively create a situation where Lovie Smith, it's been rumored, was not happy about the fact that he knew he was going to be gone and went out and tried to win these games these last 2 weeks and lost them the number one pick, which is ultimately what they were definitely, I think, playing for. And that is a management coaching relationship thing. If you have the right coach nailed down and you bring in somebody that you feel good about, and it's going to be there long term, that doesn't happen because you can probably come to agreement like, hey, sit some of our players, we'll get the number one pick. We're going to give you Bryce Young next year. It doesn't happen with a coach that knows he's getting fired, right? And Kyron told us a while back that Lovey knew he was going to be fired, weeks in advance. So, and maybe the reason for that is some of this Deshaun Watson stuff. Like, oh, well, that's on the management group as well. Like they put themselves in that situation. This is the type of like discontinuity that leads to these issues. Otherwise, I think roster wise, like they drafted pretty well. They traded back in some spots. They added some guys by trading up in some spots. They went and got guys they were interested in. And I think a lot of the young players that they have added to this roster have had good first, second years. And going forwards, if they can continue to kind of stockpile picks, use the money they have, if they find that quarterback with this number 2 pick, they're not in a bad spot to compete within, maybe not this year, but I think next year. This is, I wouldn't say like the perfect roster rebuild, but it's pretty good. And, they have corner now. They have safety now. Like they have some offensive linemen. They added a running back. They have a couple of younger receivers. We're going to see what John Mechie is. There's a reason to be excited about the growth of this team over the next couple of years.
Yeah, they have decent players, especially in some key positions. Corner, challenging to find. They've got some legitimate offensive linemen. After drafting Kenyon Green, high pedigree. They've got Laramie Tunsil. We had him as our first team All-Pro, along with Kyron. At the left tackle, Titus Howard's been a decent player. So, they can build around that. Damian Pierce. They need 2 of the most impactful positions in the NFL, though. They need a quarterback and they need an edge rusher. And I think, multiple picks are great to build depth. And that, is still, it's not a guaranteed. But based on the number of picks that they have, they should be able to effectively do that. But it really will come down to, can you nail the edge rusher? Or at least pass rusher of some kind, whether they decide that they want to go interior. It doesn't matter that much to me, as long as it's a good pass rusher and a quarterback. And I think they, again, have the opportunity with the first pick, and I think they have the 13th pick again. That's a very real goal to have this draft, but you got to nail it. As far as the coaching situation, weird. I don't know. I'm sure there's always going to be somebody who's willing to go and shoot their shot, but if I was a top coach, I would definitely look elsewhere, even with the draft picks in tow, because I don't. That management would make me pretty wary of jumping in with a lot. But um, you know, somebody will go. Somebody will go. Kyron
Yeah,
said
and
that Ryan Day. I mean, maybe again that I'm not sure. If I love picking up a guy with so little NFL coaching experience, but any last thoughts on the Texans?
yeah, I mean, it's probably a good sign that they've had some rumors about Ben Johnson. He's obviously getting interviewed. That'd be a great pickup for them with whatever quarterback they bring in. Upon thinking about it, I don't know that losing the number one pick is as big a deal as we initially made it out to be, but it's just I don't know. They've clearly this is an organization that's had some dysfunction, and they're not out of it yet, and that's the concern going forwards.
Yeah, I don't think it's a huge deal that they lost the number one pick, but it's more just about if you have the option to put yourself in that flexible situation, jumping out of it is probably, you know,
Yeah,
it
I mean
is
they have
it's a
more.
bad decision, but
Yeah,
it is what
yeah,
it is. It is what it is now. We can move on from that conversation. We've talked about it. And now we can just talk about what to do going forward. But it's because even if they did want to go with CJ Stroud and Ryan Day, having the first overall pick would still guarantee that, you know.
uh,
But
yeah.
anyway, whatever. Okay, next up, the Arizona Cardinals. Cardinals had probably the largest uh, disappointment as far as the season has gone. I don't think any of us were ever as high on their overall roster and situation as the Cardinals themselves were. But when you look at how they approached the season, what kind of investments they made, uh, you have to understand that this was a letdown of all letdowns for them. Coach is gone, GM has stepped aside, Kyler Murray is hurt. They have the general normal allotment of draft picks. They have $17 million. So the real thing about this is whoever comes in has to realize that they need to basically, chill until Kyler Murray's healthy, and then work on the roster in a way that offers some longevity to his career, I think. And I think that's really where they are right now. What would you say was the biggest thing that went wrong for their season, aside from obviously Kyler just getting hurt?
Um, Poor drafting decisions, and this has been a long time coming. I think again this year, like just deciding to draft, not even draft, like they traded their first round pick for Marquise Brown and paid him. Like, look, I think Marquise Brown's a decent player, but it's just you didn't get younger. You ate up cap space. You added a position group you've just been attacking seamlessly for years now and haven't really nailed down outside of DeAndre Hopkins. And you didn't really ever get to see it fully because by the time Hopkins was back from suspension, Marquise Brown was injured. By the time he was back from that injury, Kyler Murray was injured. I think you just put your eggs. They had these off seasons where they said this one player or these two players are going to make the difference for us. We're going to add JJ Watt. It's going to transform our defense, and we're going to go to the playoffs. And although it worked for a year, like it's not a consistent way to win games in the NFL. And I think the difference between a team like this and a team like Buffalo when they were developing their young quarterback is they didn't really try to add cheaper pieces in volume. They went out of their way to find kind of the shiny piece and swing and miss or hit on these players. And it's led to a point where either you have older talents who you're relying on, but they might be injured. And then your younger players that you have drafted, your best ones are generally day two guys who you don't really want starting immediately and haven't produced to a level that really support this roster. And a lot has been on Cliff Kingsbury's shoulders, a lot has been on Kyler Murray's shoulders, and of course, when your quarterback gets injured, everything falls apart.
Yeah, it's tough. I don't want to pile on them too much, because you can certainly find reasons for optimism in the long run. You do have Kyler Murray, who's an exceptionally talented player. You have enough flexibility that you can start to rebuild this roster however you want. I think the reality is they have to spend and invest in the trenches, particularly on the offensive line, and then the defensive line as the secondary priority. But I think without that, we're just going to continue looking at a team that just it's one-sided, it's one-dimensional. So, whoever goes there, they have their work cut out for them, but they at least know they have to know what that is. I mean, I can't imagine there's anybody going into an interview for the Arizona Cardinals GM job and is not saying we need to fix this offensive line desperately. I can't imagine that there's anybody that hasn't made that statement up front and as a priority. But there are offensive linemen in this draft. They picking as high as they are, they do also have the option to trade back. I think that is definitely something that they should consider. And with the cap space that they have and some of the moves that they can make, they can go out and find a halfway decent guard. They can go out and find a halfway decent guard. They can go out and find a tackle probably in the first round. They can find a center, and they can work on it. I'm not sure exactly what they'll look like in terms of competitiveness in 2023. I think that will largely depend on the skills of the coaching staff, because after what the Giants have done this year, I don't want to count anybody out necessarily, but they can change their trajectory for sure. All right. Indianapolis Colts. Colts are a big letdown team as well. I was a little higher on them than I was on the Cardinals, but at the same time, the roster wasn't perfect. I think they've made investments on the offensive line where the Cardinals hadn't, and they probably haven't made as many investments in playmakers as the Cardinals have. And their offensive line still was a pretty big disappointment. The defense was solid. Shaq Leonard being basically constantly hurt is something that they've got to figure out how to deal with this year, because he's getting paid too much money to be on IR all year, and it's been a consistent theme of his career. So they need to figure out if they can work on the salary. They need to figure out if there's something that they can do to help him stay healthy. They've got to figure out if ultimately, I got to look at the guarantees left in his deal. That was signed a while ago, so they might even be forced to move on from him. Even though that doesn't sound great, but it's just the reality of things. So Colts are in the position where they have a decent number of picks, nothing special. They'll always be a little bit limited financially because of the way they do business, and their roster is it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. I like some of the guys they got in the draft this year, but without a first round pick, they didn't get any super slam dunk star players. They've got some players who could develop into something very good, or they could just be solid players.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem with you drafted a lot of lower positional value players who are really quite good, and Ballard got praised for that. But then you didn't support the team that was actually structured well at a lot of these more valuable positions with depth at those positions with the money you had left over, because they didn't, spend a lot of it. They signed a lot of their own guys. And so now we're looking at tackle, and we're not certain they're set there. Looking at receiver, we're not certain they're set there. Corner, they still have some of these guys they've had for years who are decent players. Stephon Gilmore was a good ad, but depth has been an issue. They had some injuries this year, and that position got worse. They had Yannick Ngakoue as their second edge player this year, who's really a guy you want as your third edge player. And they still haven't really fully hit stride with that defensive line of what they had the year they had Phillip Rivers. That was their best year. And although they've added some big names every year since that, it just hasn't quite been the unit that you've wanted it to be once DeForest Buckner was added. So, again, this is a team that I think needs to take a look at their depth and really ask themselves how they're going to really fortify some of the better players they have on this roster, but they also just are missing some top end talents. I'd really try to get Gilmore back here. I know he's, probably expensive for an older player, but he he gave him a really good season for them. And I just think if they're trying to succeed next year with a young quarterback, like the defense was the better of the two units. The offensive line falling apart is a huge problem, and I don't really know what their immediate fix is for that because they added like a third round pick, and that obviously didn't help immediately. And it's not that they, I think, have made poor moves with the assets that they have. It's just that they, I think, didn't do enough, and they were too content with what they had put on the fourth on the field in previous years, and expected like an upgrade at quarterback would be enough to get them to the playoffs, and it just didn't happen.
Yeah, well, I think you just have to be extremely careful with how you designate your assets when you operate the way that they do, because they're not willing to go out and spend a significant amount of money on a bunch of players in free agency to change the nature of their team. They just don't do it. They might do one guy here or there, but they're really cash to cap. They really don't do much in the way of proration. And so you'll always be limited compared to other teams that don't operate that way. And that means that even more than other teams, you've got to prioritize using your high draft picks on these super expensive positional players. Like you've got to prioritize quarterback, you've got to prioritize pass rusher and corner, and they just haven't done that. And it doesn't necessarily mean it can't work, because we've seen it briefly work where the guys that you drafted at those non-premium positions were just so good that they kind of justified it briefly, but then you end up in a position where, by Quentin Nelson standards, a little bit of a down year. He's not the superstar that he was. Shaq Leonard's hurt. And then you go from having this impact player at a non-premium position to whoever comes in to replace him is, even if there was a pretty solid linebacker core, it's a replacement level guy on some level. And then you've got no star at corner, no star at pass rusher, no star at tackle, no star at quarterback, and a replacement level at a non-premium. It's just, it just isn't the most likely way to net you success. I don't like to say there's only one way to do things, but I just think you've got to prioritize better if you're the Indianapolis Colts. That's the biggest thing that I think they need to change. I think, the reality is that Alec Pierce and Michael Pittman Jr. is an okay starting receiver duo. When you throw in the fact that they have Jonathan Taylor, it's a pretty decent 1-2-3 punch at playmaker. But you've got to be really good at another part of the offense if that's who you're rolling with. And the offensive line just wasn't that. So with the highest pick as they have, we know they want to do quarterback. We know that. So what do they do to fix their offensive tackle position? I think that's the biggest question of the offseason for me. So whether it's some kind of trade or some kind of free agent signing that, it is a little bit risky, but then ultimately works out like Teron Armstead was for the Dolphins. I don't know, but that's really what I think I would watch throughout free agency, because I think, again, with the draft, we kind of know where they want to go. Anything else on the Colts before we move on here?
No, other than I think if their expectation is, I hope it's not for Irsay, is for them to make the playoffs next year with a young quarterback. I think that's a dumb expectation. That's all.
Yeah, I think it would be. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. But, considering the fact that Ballard seems to be staying and it's only a new coach coming in, how much time do you give Ballard? I mean, as an owner,
Well, again, and then we go back to, you have to make decisions. Like I think this discontinuity of regimes is a bad thing for organizations, and I think if you're holding on to Ballard, it needs to mean that you're committed to keeping him around. If you're not that committed, you should have already cut ties with him.
Yeah. Yep, I agree. I think half measures are usually just delaying the inevitable when it comes to the NFL. Just in general, kind of, but specifically in the NFL. All right.
Yep.
The Denver Broncos up next. Broncos obviously don't have their own first-round pick. They do have one later in the first round, which will fall wherever the 49ers finish. Broncos, talk about letdown. Again, to be fair, I did not pick them to make the playoffs. I think I was in the minority of that. I cannot pretend that I saw it going as poorly as it did, though. They let their head coach go. They also retain their general manager. So they have new ownership. There's a lot in flux there. The only thing we know for sure out of truly anything is that Russell Wilson will be back, because that is what the money says.
Yeah.
They would have let George Payton go, I assume, by now, if there was really any chance that was going to happen. But so it looks like he'll be back. But they need to build around, I think, a roster that they can't assume Russell Wilson will be on in the future aside from 2023, because I think if you double down on that concept, then you're just limiting yourself in the future. I think you just need to build and just kind of flip a coin and just see what happens with Russell Wilson and the new coach, because how can you bank on anything after the season that he's had, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can't, but you have to. The one thing that stood out to me, because I kicked up over our injured reserve players on the ticker below, is that this was one of the most beat up teams in football. And you can see a lot of the injuries happened early on, and you really go back and you look early in the season, like how they played, and like they lost a close game to Seattle, who is a playoff team and probably had a better start to the season than they finished with. They beat the 49ers, and I know they didn't start out like great, but it's just funny to think back that this Broncos team defensively was able to defeat San Francisco with a little support from their offense. I think the O-line getting as beat up as they were made this team worse than they were. Like, I don't think this is a 4-win team. I think this is a 7-win team that could add a couple pieces here and there and be pushing potentially to playoffs. I thought they were a 9-win team preseason. I also predicted them to miss the playoffs. I thought Miami was a better team going into the season, but Russell Wilson is probably not going to be an elite quarterback next year. He probably isn't going to be a good quarterback next year. Can he be replacement level, and can you support him with enough talent to make this team competitive? I don't know, because the division they play in is so good that it's going to be hard. So they're just in a really tough spot. And I think they didn't make a bad decision this offseason based on the spot they're in terms of going after a quarterback that could play really high level football. But it just didn't really work out for them. And the thing about this is we talk about in the previous couple of teams, like being halfway on your decisions. Like they full sent a decision and they failed. And to be honest with you, like if it worked out, like this is a Super Bowl team right now that we're talking about. And because it hasn't, like they're probably going to move on they have already moved on from their coach, obviously. I don't know how Peyton's going to fix this, but I would have to imagine like, he's walking the plank soon. And you made a decision and it didn't work out. And I don't really know how to sum it up any more than that, because I think this roster does have talent, more talent than even Indianapolis does. They swung and missed at quarterback. And I think maybe even a bigger blame this group for this is maybe hiring the coach they did because they thought they might get Aaron Rodgers. That might be the most, finger pointing type mistake that they made this offseason, just because if you traded for Russ, not necessarily first, but just had thought about that more as a possibility for your team and hired a coach that would have worked with both quarterbacks, you might not be in this situation right now.
Yeah, I mean, you don't like to make assumptions, but when that hire was made, after all of the noise that had been there for so long, it just seemed obvious that was, their goal. And because the coaching cycle happened prior to the free agency cycle where the extension was made in Green Bay, they didn't know that was going to be the case. They thought they might be able to get him. This was, if not the best, top 2 or 3 defense in the NFL. And I think there's a real case to be made that they could have been the best with some more offensive support or just even any motivation later in the season. So this team is not bereft of talent. They have a left tackle. They've got some playmakers. I think people maybe overrated the level of playmakers they had. Javonte Williams, definitely good player, got hurt. That sucks. I think when you look at Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, and Tim Patrick, it probably was always a little overrated by the general public. I
Well,
think.
Patrick got hurt in preseason too, and I think that was
did,
bigger than we
yes.
thought.
Well, I think he's a good player, and his skill set is pretty specific, but he also
he's a guy who's
does
produced
something Russell Wilson's always liked, which is
he produces with every quarterback they've brought.
Go up and get it. So, yes, that's true. So it did hurt, but and Javonte Williams went down relatively early. So, I think you can point to injuries for a lot of these teams, and I mean, you can certainly point to it for the Jets. Similar thing, star players went down, but I think that the expectations were way higher for this team, and so for a few injuries to happen to utterly and totally derail the season would probably be like an oversimplification. So they need to work on the offensive line a little bit as well. They need to nail the coach, because if they're going to be competitive in the near future, it's going to start there, and you need a guy who's basically going to come in and get Russell Wilson to do what needs to be done and how it needs to be done, or a guy who's basically got a stiff enough spine that when that doesn't work, he doesn't bat an eye and is just prepared to move on from that quarterback situation and answer all the questions that go along with it. So that's what I'll say about the Broncos. I don't think that they should rule out the possibility of drafting a quarterback late in the first round. If there's a guy that's available, I don't think you should ever truly rule that out. But, again, I'm sure that the majority of people will talk themselves into the idea that you at least have to spend it on a way to help Russ. And I don't know if I fully believe that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's funny because this is a team that if they draft a quarterback next year and they develop them for year 2, and that quarterback ends up being good, you could be a good football team that just randomly has this $50 million contract hole that you're just not thinking about that's on your roster. That might be the weirdest thing we've ever seen, but it's possible.
Well, I mean, it happens with dead money. Like, what's the difference between a loss of a roster spot? I mean,
it's just and the fact that he'll be there and he'll be on the sideline, and you'll see it happening basically live.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that sort of happened in Russell Wilson's rookie year with what was his name? Matt Flynn. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't $50 million, but compared to what the cap was back then, it was a hefty chunk of money. And he just sat. So I mean, you just gotta. I think you've just got to fix the most important position, and if you can't trust that he's going to do it with support, then you can find another guy too. All right, next up we have the Los Angeles Rams. Where I know obviously there's some level of disappointment because none of these are playoff teams, but the reality is that the first couple we kind of expected not to be good. And then there's a slew where we expected, at least generally expected them to be better, and they were just very bad. And then we're going to get to some teams where they were either slightly better than we expected or slightly worse than we expected. So the disappointment level is not as endemic. You know what I mean? It's like it's an easier fix, I think. But we are at the Rams right now, obviously coming off of the Super Bowl. Big letdown for them. Injuries to the quarterback, even in the preseason, played through it, had some other stuff, had a concussion. I think the losses on the offensive line were probably understated. It was something that I was concerned about. I kind of gave some benefit of the doubt to their coaching staff because they had largely been able to make it work so far. I mean, this is far and away the worst season that Sean McVay has ever had as a head coach, and it's not even close. They still had a lot of talented players on the defense.
It includes his time in Washington too, as I should say. Yeah.
Yes. Yep. I mean, he has a really good record as a head coach, and I don't want to forget that. But And he's been there for a while, since 2017. So, it's not a small sample size at this point. So, it's the Rams. So I think one of the things is that you look at this roster and it's like, okay, you got Brian Allen, you have Matthew Stafford, but outside of Cooper Kupp, what is this roster? Where are the special players?
Yeah, and Allen Robinson's on IR, and I honestly had completely forgotten that he was on the Rams. I think we have to start making a rule that you're just not allowed to sign Allen Robinson if you want to compete anymore in the NFL, because he just seems to lose wherever he goes. I guess it's unfortunate, but it's definitely not him. I'm just joking, but this is what happens when you trade all your picks away. Like we kind of all sat here and expected this at some point to be a problem. And it's not that this is happening directly because they trade all their picks away, but it's certainly impacted them. And now it's going to be a problem going forwards because they're not as, they don't have the assets to really restock despite a season where they underperformed. And even good teams have seen, like the Patriots are like a rare example. I think the Chiefs right now are going to be a rare example going forward. They just like have such good coaching and quarterback play that they can avoid having down seasons ever. Everyone else has down seasons. The Packers with Aaron Rodgers have down seasons. Like it happens. And I think the expectation for this team is that they were going to avoid ever having something like this occur where they're now giving up a top pick and it looks awful considering what they gave up picks for. Now they won a Super Bowl, so maybe they don't care. But in the long run, the people who were involved with winning that Super Bowl now still have job question marks because you have to put out a product in future years that's going to go compete. And not only are they lacking depth, but they're starting to lose some of their star players that they really had. I mean, they lost some this offseason, and we thought it was a concern. That's why I picked them to be worse this year in terms of record that they had added in midseason last year to get to the Super Bowl. A lot of short-term gain, giving up long-term assets will eventually end up with you hurting in the long term, and that's why they are where they are. Now, I will say the Stafford injury is a unfortunate development, but also along with that, we had concerns about that during the trade. I remember when Washington was like one of the big names for trading for Stafford, and I was kind of not completely on board. Like I was like, it might be fine. This was during the Fields and Lawrence draft, so I was kind of more in the let's trade for a Fields or Trey Lance boat because I felt long term those guys are around longer. I thought their ceilings were higher than Matt Stafford still think. In both their cases, the ceiling is higher than Matthew Stafford. But he had back problems. He had knee problems. He had shoulder problems. He has elbow problems now. He had concussions. Like this guy's been beat up throughout his career. And to expect that wasn't going to be a factor at all in trading, a starting quarterback who's played well for the Lions and 2 first-round picks for him was a little short-sighted in the fact that, yes, you win a Super Bowl, but now are we certain that he's like ready to go next year? Because it seems like this guy has multiple injuries still.
I don't know if he's ready to go, honestly. That's a question that only time will give an answer to. I mean, they were still my NFC Super Bowl pick for a couple of reasons. One, because I wasn't sure what Trey Lance was going to look like in San Francisco. I thought it was a great roster. It could be held back by the quarterback. We saw plenty of inconsistency from him before he went down. And so even though the ceiling's a little lower, their floor is raised, and obviously they're a good team. Same thing with Philly, high on the roster. Didn't know that Jalen Hurts was going to take such a massive step forward. And so the Rams were the team that I thought had the best shot to go back to the Super Bowl. Just when you look at the star power, which all is still in its prime, theoretically speaking. I mean, between Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford and the guys that won in the Super Bowl last year, Jalen Ramsey and Aaron Donald. I mean, I thought that between those guys, they would probably win enough games to get to the playoffs, and then they had as good a shot as anybody, within those games. I didn't think they were gonna, go 14-3 or whatever, but I just thought within the conference that might be the case. So, now you look at it and you have the questions. Does Aaron Donald continue to play? I mean, he's making so much money. It'd be hard to walk away from that personally, but I know he's made a lot of money. Bobby Wagner is another year older. Jalen Ramsey, and he'll probably still be a good corner, but another year older. Offensive line, not very good. So you should probably try and fix that. You're over the cap by about $8 million. So you've got some work to do there. And you need to somehow find an offensive lineman without, or maybe multiple offensive linemen without a first-round pick. So is it doable? Yeah. Is it pretty challenging? 100%. So I think a lot of what this will come down to is how healthy Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford are coming back, because, that's, it's basically guaranteed 1,600 yards of offense if those two guys are on the field together. And then you just got to work the other stuff around that. So any last thoughts on the Rams before we...
I didn't pick them to win the division this year because I, quite frankly, thought they were a little lucky to win the Super Bowl last year. I mean, they played to their outs to get to that point, and good for them. But, I think that they had a lot of work to be done still to get themselves to being a consistent contender, and they didn't get there, obviously. And now, this has the makings of being the next New Orleans Saints if they keep trying to run it back and keep trying to add big players and trying to go for another Super Bowl, because I don't really think they're close right now. I don't think one big name corner, wide receiver, edge, tackle really gets them there. And I just think they're closer to needing to be a rebuild team than a Super Bowl team. And I think that's the direction they should be heading in because of it.
Well, I think a lot of it will depend on whether Sean McVay comes back, because McVay at this point, he seems like he's either in and trying to win or moving on to something else and letting the rebuild happen. So I think if we get through the next month, basically, if we get through the Super Bowl and he is still the head coach, then I suspect that they will try and run this back at least one more year.
Yeah, probably. I mean, but
which is tough. It's tough to just basically operate off of one person's life decision like that, but it's going to be what it's going to be. Yeah. All right. The Raiders. Raiders are a team where new head coach comes in, brings a new general manager with him, essentially. And the quarterback is a holdover. They give him a deal with minimal guarantees, minimal investment. It's a rolling guarantee, not even rolling. It is a guarantee structure that, basically kicks in after a certain point, which makes it easier than normal to move on from a starting quarterback. At some point in the late season, they decide that's what they want to do. Carr is benched, and they go into this offseason with a pretty healthy assortment of draft picks, including one in the top 10, multiple fifth-round picks. So this is definitely the type of haul where you can reshape a roster in your own image, maybe not fully change it, but Carr is an interesting one because I've said that they will probably trade him. I don't think releasing him makes sense based on how valuable a quarterback can be, but they also have a time crunch. So the return for him is probably not as good as it would be if you had a little bit more flexibility as far as that goes. But they do have cap space. They will free up cap space when he's released or when he's traded. So whatever the case, they have lots of options. So it will just depend on who they can get in the offseason to be their quarterback. They're picking high, but without a trade up, they certainly can't guarantee the quarterback that they want. And it would be a little risky to wait based on the number of quarterback needy teams. You might go after one in free agency. We definitely speculated about Tom Brady, just like everybody else. So going forward, they've got options. I can't say I know for sure what they want to do, but they also have some guys that are already on the roster who can, immediately contribute. So if you could point to one thing that was the fall of the Raiders this year, what would you say that it was?
Well, I'll say like the big news story this morning is that Derek Carr said his goodbye to the Raiders, and they're very much moving on at this point. Looks like they will work together to get a trade done, so he's probably not going to get cut.
Which
The
is what I
problem,
said. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
sorry,
I want to toot my own horn there because I was like, there's just no way that he's going to
yeah,
just be a free agent.
yeah, yeah. You called that
It's
a
throwing
while
money out
back.
the window.
Yeah, I don't know why I ever thought that was possible, but maybe I felt there might be a more ugly breakup than there is, but clearly not. Um, they thought they were better than they were. I think that's the problem. They thought that getting Devontae Adams would put them over the top, and I think their 10-7 record last year was misleading. It really was. They had issues on the offensive line. They had a really high end output from their defensive line, despite really having like one really good player on that group last year. And they thought that adding like an older Chandler Jones would really, really put that unit over the top. In fact, it still was not a terrible pass rush unit, but just they weren't going to replicate production wise what they did last year. And then offensively, like Devontae Adams had a big year. It didn't even really matter because they had more injuries. Um, the offensive line continued to just not be as good in pass protection. They even ran the ball like way better this season. Statistically, like you could compare this team from last season to last year, and there's maybe more things just in the raw numbers they did better than they did last year. It didn't end up turning into wins because I think last year they ended up getting a little bit of the variance of catching some of their big plays and big moments, winning a lot of close games, and it just went the opposite this season. They lost a lot of big leads early on in games like against teams that were good, but also teams that they can compete with. Like we've seen this team play the Chiefs close, but that only gets you so far. You have to be able to finish a game against them, and a better team is more likely to do that. And they just, I don't know. The Raiders are a middling NFL team. They have a range of outcomes that is from what they were this year to what they were last year. And it was silly to ever expect them to be like a team that could win 13 games in the Super Bowl, which I think kind of the media propped up a little bit more than maybe even the Raiders thought, but they certainly bought into that a little bit this offseason.
Well, I just want to throw something out there. I don't know if you caught the recurring theme for a lot of these teams. Quarterback obviously is an issue, but offensive line has been an issue for almost every team that we've talked about so far, particularly those that have had a disappointing season versus expectations. Most of them thought they could go farther than they could without making enough investment on the offensive line. And they have defensive issues as well. I think they've got some good players. Obviously, Max Crosby is an awesome player. You can probably get by with guys like Bilal Nichols and Andrew Billings running the style of defense that they do, but I think you need a corner. You really need a corner that could do a lot. Nate Hobbs is a pretty good slot guy, but like someone outside who can really impact coverage, and you need to build that offensive line. And then quarterback, I don't know what they want to do. I mean, they do seem like an obvious landing place for Tom Brady, but again, we just have no idea how much of a positive relationship that Brady and McDaniels have. It could be a fine relationship. It could be a bad one, but I don't think he'd go there unless it was really, really good. Just because there are other places that do have probably slightly better talent situations. So, I think we could see that work positively in their favor if the relationship is already there. If it's not something special, then I don't think it will make enough of a difference just that they worked together before. So, I mean, get offensive line players because Brady doesn't like getting rushed up the middle or from anywhere for that matter. And then the defense will probably be what holds you back slightly. But if you can do that, if you can get the quarterback in the offensive line, you could probably compete either way.
Yeah, I think the Leatherwood pick really killed this team, and it's unfortunate because I think a lot of people saw that one coming, and it just, I don't know, the evaluation there was not great. We've heard rumors that John Gruden was kind of in charge of a lot of the earlier picks, Mike Mayock, a lot of the later picks that they got right. That felt a lot like an award season draft pick where you didn't really watch enough of the film and really see what type of player it was, because we all at Boomer Bust had him around in the 80s on our boards. he physically wasn't super special, and the production really wasn't there. And it's, he's obviously like wasn't even on the team after a year. So in terms of developing your offensive line, like if you hit on a tackle there, you're in a much better spot than you are right now. But I think the reason you see a lot of these teams lower down is the offensive line is very much it's a unit that I think when you're good at, it supports you well. I don't think you like win games alone because of your offensive line, but when you're not good there, it's disastrous. And so a lot of the worst teams in the NFL really struggled there.
So just briefly looking at this offensive line as it stands, outside of Colton Miller, who do you think is a viable starter for them in 2023?
Well, I think Parham's going to be back because he's young, right? But he didn't have the best early season. I liked him coming out. We'll see. He's going to get another year. And Andre James had a decent year at center last year and this year. I think he's a big reason why the run game was able to work. He's a guy that I would expect comes back and plays well again. It's really the right side they're going to focus on if they want to compete next year. And I would think that guard, tack, I mean, obviously both those positions. Illuminor has been a journeyman, backup. And Alex Bars is not a guy you really want starting long-term either. Maybe Thayer Munford develops and becomes a piece for you, but I think he's more likely just a good backup. I would expect that they hit that right side of the offensive line hard, both the free agency and the draft.
All right. Let's take a look at our next team, which are the Atlanta. We might have to move the pace up a little bit here, but this is a recurring theme for us on this show. We get into the weeds on stuff, which we love to talk about. But anytime we're talking about more than like 6 teams, just
it's tough.
Gotta force ourselves. All right, Falcons. Falcons have a ton of money, an average assortment of picks, and a team that has like pretty clear needs. I think they need a quarterback. Desmond Ridder. Look, if you want to roll with him next year, you got to add at least some kind of veteran to push him to help the quarterback room at the very least. They're high enough where if they decide they want to draft a quarterback, they can do that. Their offensive line was slightly better than expected.
Quite good, actually.
And then, pretty solid, especially at the run blocking. I think, pass blocking still a little questionable. But if you operate out of as much play action as they like to, then not necessarily the biggest deal. They've got some playmakers, honestly. Defense and quarterback is where these guys need to invest. They've made some defensive investments already. They've got a corner. Grady Jarrett is probably going to stick around for at least another year because they have money. But they need a legit pass rusher. Probably need some work throughout the middle of the defense. Linebacker, safety, probably could just use more depth at a number of those places. But they've got to get a guy who can legitimately rush the passer. And they've got to get a guy who can lead the offense and throw the ball. So just taking a look at, can't believe Cleveland Farrell is still on the Raiders, by the way. But anyway, still starting. Yeah, I mean, look, he's not a bad player, but just like
he's not a number 4 pick. Yeah.
Yes.
I want to start off the Falcons by saying that there were 18 teams this year, about 56% of clubs that won between 7 and 10 games. This was not a high-end year for NFL teams to like really show off like who was great and who wasn't. We talked about early on, we didn't know who was good, and we still kind of finished the season not knowing really the differentiation between the Falcons, who are the highest picking of these 18 teams, and the Chargers, who are the lowest right now because of their playoff seeding. And these two teams played each other, and it was a close, impactful playoff game between the Chargers and the Falcons. So, like, I think we're in kind of the gap of, like, there's not a big separation between these teams and, like, legitimately teams that are probably going to win a playoff game or at least one, although the Chargers have the high end because of their quarterback play. In Atlanta, you could argue, like, they kind of got screwed by a call against the Buccaneers in their first matchup. Maybe they win that game, and they'd be in the playoffs today. Like, it's kind of funny the small margins here that these teams have to make the postseason. Ultimately, like, I think there's some really good things to build off of, and they're kind of in an excellent spot to be picking 8th because they can look at quarterbacks and go after one with the offensive line they have. I think the problem that the Falcons have is they really, really focused on making sure Arthur Smith's system worked, and they prioritized the heck out of that, but they haven't really done a whole lot else. And they've added some pieces, I think, defensively that are decent and going forward you're happy about. But the identity of this team existing is not supported by much else. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's again just it's an argument of they did some really nice things. They could have done more. And so this becomes an offseason where you really need to commit to some decisions. Like you're going to have to add a lot of pieces. You have some money. You have some players maybe that are older, like Grady Jarrett, that you can either trade, get rid of, figure out a way to get some assets from them, and then go for it. And I don't know if that's getting a rookie quarterback and having them in a system that I think really supports a young player because you're gonna have that play action and that run game. They're gonna be decent offensively, I think, next year, regardless. How do you then support him with a defense? Make sure a rookie quarterback doesn't go through the growing pains. This team isn't that far away, I believe, but it's just what is your secondary thing to lean on outside of this kind of outside zone play action offense?
Yeah, I don't know. I would like to see them go after a veteran quarterback. I think because I just think they need to show something, some real life, like not be in contention for a division where a team that went under 500 made the playoffs.
Yeah.
And not even win. They've got to show some real fire next year in terms of competitiveness, because I just don't think that this staff will last if they don't. And I'm just concerned that a rookie we could end up seeing something like the Bears where they draft a quarterback high and the staff doesn't stay because they're entering year 4 and it's not enough. So I think they should consider a vet, maybe one of the high-end vets, maybe a Derek Carr. Maybe this is a Derek Carr destination. I know he's not necessarily quite as athletic as a Tannehill or a Mariota, but he's actually not a bad athlete, and he's a better quarterback, like better passer than either of them. Bigger arm. And so, if you are going to run the heck out of the ball and you're going to be that good at it, then maybe he's the type of player that you want to bring in. I worry about going into year 3 and then finally making an investment at quarterback. And it's not like you got the first overall pick where you can just take Bryce Young and be pretty confident of what he might look like early. Like if you're picking here, you might be looking at a Will Levis, or then you're trading assets to go up and get him. And then you don't have them to get your pass rusher stuff. So I think if you can maybe secure a guy like a Derek Carr with a second round pick, and then use your first round pick on a pass rusher, use your $58 million, aside from paying Carr, to add a few more players, that is probably a quicker recipe for success. And even though I don't always preach that, we've seen some ugly rookie seasons, and I
agree.
I've never seen Arthur Smith develop a quarterback before.
It's true.
So we have no idea what that looks like.
He might not want to, and we gave him Garoppolo in our quarterback assignment video. I think that's an interesting fit. I think Tannehill is too. I think those are both guys that have a floor that's high enough that with their comfortability with a system like this, they could compete in this division next year. One that's really interesting, and they might be picking too high for this, but what if they go and they get Anthony Richardson and they say, we're just never going to throw the ball? And this was kind of like what we thought of with Malik Willis last year, and I don't think it would have worked with him. But I think with Richardson, you could legitimately devise some sort of scheme where you run the ball more than 50% of the time, which is unheard of in today's NFL. But it would be interesting. I don't think it's going to happen. But
I mean, they've got the running backs to do it. They have an offensive line to do it. I think that's an interesting interesting option. But yeah, I mean, maybe they do. I mean, they've got big, strong dudes. Like they've got big, strong dudes who can block on the outside at receiver as well. So it's like, you probably, if you're Drake London, you're probably not excited about that idea. Yeah. But I mean, yeah, theoretically, but also then you don't get your pass rusher, and then you've got to then you just, anytime you don't create a defense that can make plays, or don't build a defense that can make plays, you just give yourself so much less room for error. Like if you don't build a defense that can create turnovers or have to generate 3 and outs, you just don't give yourself room for error because you have to score to keep up versus scoring to lead. And I don't know. It's possible. It's an idea. I mean, hey, maybe they could score a boatload of points doing that.
We're in agreement here that they are a team that is better a fit for signing one of these free agents probably than drafting a quarterback.
I think so, just because they waited on quarterback, and now, and they drafted Kyle Pitts and they drafted Drake London. They didn't draft a pass rusher or a quarterback in either of those drafts. So, you could probably pay a pass rusher too if you really wanted to, but it's like those guys just aren't that readily available. So
I don't know who they're paying.
All right. So moving on to another team in the NFC South, we have the Carolina Panthers. Panthers are over the cap by a projected $6 million. As of right now, they've got some decent picks. They've got more next year as well, I think, from the Christian McCaffrey trade. They kind of robbed themselves of some picks with the Baker Mayfield trade, with the Matt Corral trade up, which was, I thought, was an awful decision. I can't believe that they've spent I think it was three. How much did they trade for Baker Mayfield? Was it a fifth?
It was a fifth, yeah.
Two-thirds and a fifth for Matt Corral and Baker Mayfield, who, one is not on the team and one was not a believer. But
start, yeah.
I don't even know if he's like a decent backup. So they don't have a lot of space. They do have some players, though, fortunately for them. They have let's do it this way. They have an offense that boasts Ike Mekwonu, DJ Moore, Bradley Bozeman, Terrace Marshall Jr. They've got a defense that boasts guys like Brian Burns, Derek Brown, J.C. Horn, Jeremy Chin. You know what I mean? So like this is a team that has some pretty darn good players, and I think leadership is something that they lacked. The offensive line was a lot better this year. The defense took a step back prior to Matt Rule leaving, and then was actually pretty decent down the stretch. I don't think Scott Fitterer should stay personally, because I don't know how much authority Matt Rule necessarily had when it came to personnel decisions, but like, trading for CJ Henderson, I get the idea of trying to buy low, but still, that's a third-round pick for a player that another team was like, we don't even want you after one season of a top 10 investment. And, trading for an injured Stephon Gilmore. So it's like, you trade for him and then you don't even really get him. And then the trades for Sam Darnold, the trade for Baker Mayfield, the trade up for Matt Corral. It's like, I don't know how you justify keeping Scott Fitterer around when you're resetting a coach anyway. I think that's probably be a clean slate. But regardless, there is at least some talent on this team, and they need a coach to come in and decide, what it is they want to do with that.
Yeah, I know they've sunk a lot of assets into trading for QBs, but like, this is one of these teams where I kind of feel more comfortable than most if they wanted to trade for like an Aaron Rodgers or somebody, like, just because it's going to be early in a new coaching tenure. And I do think this roster is pretty decent. Like, the offensive line quietly, like, really got fixed this offseason. It was one of their stronger units. They have some receivers who they both developed, some younger guys this year, and DJ Moore is kind of a stud. Like, that guy's like a really good football player. They have locked up long term. They have defensive talent all over the place. Like, this could be one of those top 10, top 5 you catch good variance defenses next year. The staff that comes in is going to kind of swing how good this team is depending on who the quarterback is. And because of that, because quarterback is your one question mark, you're early in a new regime, I don't really know what specifically they need to like add to this roster to really make it better. They seem like they're a spot where you should be going all in on a quarterback. The problem this offseason was they didn't really have the ability to with the draft. They couldn't go after a quarterback this year. And they kind of had to sit through another year of Matt Rule because it's a guy they paid a lot of money to, and ultimately that hire just was probably the problem with these past couple of years because he was not a guy who showed the ability to turn them around.
Yeah, I think quarterback is the big question for them because, whatever free agents you have, you can make it work because the core is there. Whatever you need to do to add depth, you can make it work. You can make some cuts, you can do some restructures, you can do whatever you need to do, and this roster will mostly still be what it is and pretty decent. But quarterback is the big question, and the coach who comes in, I think, is going to really tell us what they want to do with that. It will at least give us an indication. The challenging thing about quarterback in this draft is that you've got basically 3 to 4 guys who could potentially go somewhere in the top 10. I think top 15 is probably realistic. And they're not all home runs, or they're not all necessarily easily translatable in terms of Will Levis or Anthony Richardson. But picking where they are, which I want to say is it 8 or 9?
It's 9.
9. So you can't wait necessarily, because if there are guys or teams who want one of those guys, they will jump you, which means you have to trade up to go get one. And then the question is, how high do you have to trade up? Which one do you want? Which one do you really believe in? Are you a team that wants to go from 9 to 1 to try and just go get Bryce Young? Is that what you want to do? So I don't think anything's off the table as far as that goes, but I also think their team is about to get pretty expensive. So a rookie quarterback makes the most sense for their long-term building process. I don't think trading for an expensive player is the way to go for them.
Yeah, they're in the good spot of being able to draft whatever position they can draft best player available. We often talk about with quarterback development, because all these guys are year 2. You ask yourself with our grading, at SIS, if it's a win because of, win with, win in spite of, or you can't win with type quarterbacks. Bryce Young to me is the only guy who immediately can be a win because of quarterback. CJ Stroud's probably a win with quarterback right off the bat. That could be a win because of someday. Levis and Richardson are probably year 1 win in spite of at best, right? Now Levis year 2 could be a win because of at best. Richardson, I don't know if he's at that point year 2. He probably needs a few years, but those guys are not. I wouldn't expect to be winning right off the bat, and that's a problem with the current GM, because I don't know. Again, this might be Fitterer's last year.
Yeah, that's the one thing. I don't like to be flippant with people's jobs, but I also, again, half measures in the NFL, I just don't really believe in them. So I understand that you hired Rule 1 year earlier than you hired Fitterer. So you had 3 years of Rule, now 2 years of Fitterer. But, I would just call it and try and just start fresh, especially if you want to go after another big-name coach or whatever. But I think the thing about Richardson is he could be a win because of, if you build your offense right, which is one of those things where it's like that's the one thing that made me hesitate with the Falcons, because they run the ball so much that they could incorporate that quarterback run scheme into it probably better than most.
Yeah, and Carolina decently did well with that this year too. It's kind of under the radar, but I don't know if they're going to be that going forwards. We'll see.
Yeah, it just depends on who they bring. But all right. Yep, we shall see. Next up, we have the New Orleans Saints. New Orleans sitting at a pleasant $50 million over the cap projected right now. No first round pick. They've got a 2, 3, 4, 2 5s, and 2 7s. So the Saints and Michael Thomas I will point out that some of these numbers can fluctuate just because some teams are in the process of making moves. you know, either doing extensions or already working on restructures to help players get their cap hits down. Looks like Michael Thomas will be released. I don't know. We talked about this before. If I was Michael Thomas, I would have just said no. But if he is planning to retire, then yeah, you just say yes. So we'll see. I mean, if he just doesn't want to deal with the injuries anymore, if he just doesn't want to deal with the grind, yeah, I get that. So, I mean, again, I need to look at it and see in greater detail what they actually did with his contract. But to me, the only reason I agree to something if I'm Michael Thomas is if I'm going to retire. So I would keep an eye on that. But aside from that, they're an old team that has just a lot of investments, no real quarterback answer. A coach that we're not 100% sure if he'll be back. I mean, I think he would have been gone by now if he was. So he'll probably be here, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not even sure what to say about this team. I mean, I think that they've got to bite the bullet soon.
Yeah, let's just call it out. I mean, it's not, I don't even want to call it like panic trades, because I don't think they're panicking. I think just like not well thought out trades. Like this team we got to add another one, because we talked about these 2 Eagle trades. We talked about not the AJ Brown trade. There's another trade with them. Maybe we talked about a previous year, but they've had a bunch of trades that haven't gone well for them. And on top of that, like we're now seeing kind of, they also traded Chris Olave for Chris Olave and gave Washington Jahan Dotson, Brian Robinson, and Sam Howell for that. So that also doesn't appear to maybe be working out for them. But it's just they were so aggressive with their assets, trying to buy their way back into contention, that they're in a hole. And I don't think they're getting out of it for the next couple of seasons. And makes I think it's why Dennis Allen's still going to be around, because I quite frankly think he's just kind of like okay with having a head coaching job and sticking around for a little bit. But yeah, this is a tough spot. I don't really see it turning around anytime soon.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just did a very quick check in on it, and so the Saints are probably saving themselves about $11 million of cap space. With the Michael Thomas move that hasn't really like become recorded necessarily yet, but yeah, I mean, good career Michael Thomas for while it lasted. Unfortunately, just couldn't stay healthy. But I don't think any bold moves would benefit this roster in any way, shape, or form. I think you just bite the bullet as best you can in 2023, and then in 2024, the cap is set to go up anyway. Just due to the TV deals. So just eat it, have a year. And if you outperform and you prove you should keep the job for Dennis Allen, then attack 2024. You'll have a first round pick again. You'll actually have cap space again. You'll be able to release older players. So just whatever you can do to avoid bogging yourself down future years, that's what you need to do this year. And it's a crappy division. So unless the Panthers and Falcons kind of hit it out of the park this offseason, you might be the one to go under 500 and win a division next year. But don't overinvest thinking that's what's going to happen. So I didn't even
yeah, we can.
I'll do it briefly because I mean just to look at this, I mean Marquez Callaway, yeah, you're gonna have to upgrade there if you wanted to be competitive. The offensive line's okay. They'll get their first round pick healthy again next year. We'll see what he looks like. Adam Troutman, fine tight end. Traquan Smith, obviously not very good. Chris Olave, being healthy, would be above him. Quarterback issue. Running back, Alvin Kamara is getting older. At this point, he's not the same player that he was. Defensively, Marcus Davenport had a decent year. David Onyemata's a decent player. Wouldn't be surprised if he's released, though. Cam Jordan, getting older, had a significantly diminished impact versus what he did last year. I think linebacker is probably the best defensive unit they had this year. Marcus May, Tyrann Mathieu, both players that might not necessarily be back. I have to see what all those contracts look like, but they've got to free up space somehow, and a lot of these guys are 30 plus at this point. So just not a healthy roster, so to speak.
Nope.
Okay. Tennessee Titans. Tennessee Titans are another team that is projected to be over the cap as of right now. They are not the best roster either. They need offensive line help. I wouldn't be at all surprised if Taylor Decker is released because he's been hurt every single year. Ben Jones is a good center. He'll be healthy again next year. They've got to add offensive line pieces, especially because it is important to what they want to do offensively. Even if they do change schematically, at least to some degree, I always think that will be important to them just ideologically. I think it's what Mike Vrabel wants. Derrick Henry could be a trade candidate or released to a team that is more competitive. Ryan Tannehill could be back. He could also be a release candidate. I think Robert Woods is a release candidate. I think almost any player who costs money on this offense is a release candidate. Defensively, not sure why it's a little faded there, but Jeffrey Simmons is going to get paid. Bud Dupree is a release candidate. They should try and move on from that in any way that they can. Kevin Byard's probably the only player who's paid right now who's really safe. I think Zach Cunningham is a release candidate. Who else? I think everybody else is probably going to stay, just because they're either young or inexpensive enough that their play warrants what they're compensated. So I'm not saying all of those guys will be gone, but I think any of them could be. So even what you're looking at right now, I just don't expect it to look that similar. And then as far as how their season ended up this year, what would you say was the most instigating factor for it?
I don't know. I just never had a high-end outcome. Like, that's just kind of the way they've been built. And I think it eventually kind of, I hate using the word like it went stale, but it kind of like it did. It kind of just, look, this is the other team besides Denver that is got a long list of injured reserve players. And it's been this way for 3 years straight because they play a style of football that is very upfront. We want to punch you in the mouth over and over again until you lose. And they got the number 1 seed last year, and I think that was a little bit misleading because the division they played in was really bad, and they just kind of won 12 games, and some of the other teams didn't win as many as maybe they were built to win. Like Buffalo had won 11 games last year. I think they were a better team than an 11-win team, but just, Tennessee won a close game in Buffalo. They won against the Titans too, or against the Chiefs too when they were down, and it kind of made them believe maybe that they were better than they were. And then their best player, AJ Brown, they got rid of. So it just, I don't know what their expectations were for high-end outcomes, but once you do that, any real Super Bowl outcomes, which I think were always, I don't want to say pipe dream, like I think they existed, but were very reliant on, a few high-end players, kind of got eliminated. And their high end was something that they didn't even reach this year. I think their best outcome this season was like a 10-win team that wins the division. And they win 7. And I think maybe that's more towards the middle of their outcomes than people really thought, because we see all the injuries. Their offensive line is very run blocking first. It's not much of a pass protected unit. They run all this play action similar to what Atlanta does because it's Arthur Smith's system. Tannehill's like a fine quarterback. He's probably better than people give him credit for, but just not good enough to overcome, a receiving core that's not great. And then defensively, like they force turnovers. And really the past 2 years, they've been a little bit lucky to continue to do that, but they're not really a great defense either. So I don't know. I picked this team to finish 3rd in their division preseason. I think the division being bad let them finish 2nd. And I think their own, again, this is kind of similar to the Raiders. I think their own expectations for this roster were higher than really should have been.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I didn't pick them to win the division. I thought it would be a division won by a team that didn't necessarily have an outstanding record. I just thought it would be the Colts, not the Jaguars. But I kind of felt this coming for the Tennessee Titans. All right. Next up, we have the Cleveland Browns. They are projected to be 12 million over the cap, but they can manage that pretty effectively. Most of the guys that they haven't already restructured, so they can put themselves in a decent position pretty quickly, especially with Deshaun Watson if they want to do that. And there's no reason that they wouldn't, because he's fully guaranteed for multiple years. So even if they regret the move, they're well locked into it for a number of years now. So that's an easy financial out for them in terms of just creating space. I think, Mark Cooper, good player, one of the best offensive lines in the NFL, even if it was a little banged up this year. They've already extended Jack Conklin. Donovan Peoples-Jones is developing into a nice player. With a run-heavy offense, he's probably a viable number 2 receiver. David Njoku, they extended. So it's like this entire offense will be back next year. Kareem Hunt is probably the only one that's not, and that is, even though he's good, he's certainly a replaceable player. Defense, it will largely look the same again, and I don't really think there's any reason that it shouldn't. They released their defensive coordinator. They will look to upgrade through that. They will also be able to address some of the defensive interior issues that they had. They need more there. They need to be able to stop the run better. They need to be able to rush the passer better from the interior. And I think they've got the talent to be very competitive. It's really about like how do they pick themselves up off the turf from this season and everything that went along with it, and basically, rebrand themselves going into 2023, because the roster, don't think it's going to change much. Coaching staff will change minimally, and aside from the obvious quarterback issues, what would you say was the biggest reason that the Browns ended up where they were in 2022?
Well, I think we kind of knew they had some defensive depth issues, and they came back to bite them a little bit more than maybe expectations initially thought. They really had corner depth issues last year. I think they fixed it, most part getting healthier, just drafting more, maybe adding a couple more guys there this season. And then the defensive line depth hit them, and they have added some guys there, but they just haven't really gotten any better play from their day 2 picks than they maybe hoped for. And so they're just going to have to go back to the well here, probably reinvest in the defensive line, probably, again, try to look for a second receiver, although I don't think for this team in particular it's as important because of how much they run the ball. It's going to come down to quarterback play and how well their quarterback does play. I think what's concerning for this team is that early in the season with Jacoby Brissett, you did get really good quarterback play, and they just weren't really winning games. And it was weird inconsistencies where, like, one week, they're throwing the ball and they're moving it well, and their secondary is just having breakdowns left and right. And the next week they can't stop the run, and then the next week, their quarterback has a bad game finally because he's Jacoby Brissett. He's not really an elite quarterback. None of these units are dominant other than their offensive line, and so they kind of need something to become of a secondary high floor. And the expectation has to be either that comes from the quarterback you traded for, or from some weird asset you get from these kind of day 2, day 3 picks. Or you're not going to probably sign anyone. You're probably going to have to cut somebody to get rid of some cap space here. But I mean, they're effectively running it back and hoping that what we've seen from this team 2 years ago is still there.
Yeah, and I think that it's a justifiable goal. I think it's a justifiable perspective to take on it. Obviously, I think it was a mistake to trade for Deshaun Watson. But that all being done and,
well, and as much as they did, really.
Unfixable. Yeah, it is what it is, and it's done now. They really have no choice but to just operate with that and just hope that the late season rust that he had this year doesn't follow through. I mean, I would think that with an offseason as the starter, with probably a little bit less media scrutiny, maybe not a lot, but at least a little bit less, like some of that initial, shockwave is kind of out of the way, and then a full training camp with a full set of preseason games and going right into week 1 and not really losing that momentum, it will probably be better. So I don't really know what else to tell you aside from that to the listeners, but they have every opportunity to be a good team next year. And it really just depends on what their mental fortitude is, because I think that's the question.
Yeah. Agreed.
So now we get to the New York Jets, who came out yesterday, released their offensive coordinator, Mike LaFleur. Unfortunately, I personally feel like that is kind of a same old Jets move. I think that is a characteristic of the NFL where it's like, bad season, somebody pays. And I don't always think that's the case. I think every single person who is very good at their job or talented has down years, or a down stretch. In the NFL, it's really measured by years. But to me, they really have to have somebody in their back pocket who is going to come in and be a legit hire, because otherwise this is a lateral to slightly backwards move. And I don't really love it. And I know for sure it was not the coaching staff's decision. This is an ownership decision. And that feels like some of the systematic issues that they had before when Woody Johnson was in charge, because it's obviously Woody's team. He went away. If people don't know this, he went away to be the UK ambassador during the Trump administration, and his brother Chris Johnson basically took over, and he was there for the hiring of Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas and basically this Jets turnaround. And this is Woody's first year back, and it kind of feels like we might be getting back to some of the same stuff that caused us to be a perennially losing franchise. And I know they didn't ultimately make the playoffs or have a winning record this year, but major progress in general, I would say, and this just worries me a little bit. But aside from that, just because it's new news, the Jets have about $3 million in cap space, according to overthecap.com. So I'm not sure why 3, because it had said more previously. So I have to double check on that. But the roster is, I think this is, let me just see. All right. So the roster is, it's not bad, honestly. They've got a good core of players. They need to work on the offensive line as well. Offensive line injuries were a big problem for this team. Losing Breece Hall was a big problem for this team early in the year. They need some safety help. Their corners have been excellent. They have a good defensive line, but they have free agents that they'll have to work on a little bit as well. So they have a pretty okay assortment of draft picks, nothing special, but they're not really limited either. And they're picking at about 13, so in the mid-range. They're flexible as it stands right now. So what would you say was the biggest issue with the Jets this season?
It's tough because I don't really think the Jets did a whole lot wrong. I think that they just picked the wrong quarterback 2 years ago. Which is tough to say because they have developed this defense to being quite good. They have weapons on the offense. The offensive line had a lot of injuries. It wasn't as good as it should have been maybe late season, but early in the year it looked good. They even had running backs that were looking really good early in the year. It just came down to the fact the quarterback position didn't work out in a season where everything else lined up. And it comes back to the decision you made at the position where Zach Wilson clearly has not developed into that guy year 2. That's basically enough to keep you from being a playoff team in this league.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that I lament the release of Mike LaFleur. I think after what he did last year, he was pretty limited this year. Last year, they just came up with a lot of stuff, a lot of trick plays, and they had a pretty high hit rate on those trick plays. They were an overall bad team, but the offense was actually better than the defense. And they made a lot of investments on defense this offseason. Quentin Williams developed, and they stayed pretty healthy. Offensively, they didn't stay healthy. a lot of key investments got hurt. Their first round pick from 2020, Mekhi Becton, hurt before the season. First round pick from 2021, Elijah Vera Tucker got hurt. Second round pick, Breece Hall got hurt. Zach Wilson was awful, and then Mike White got hurt. So it's like, I just don't know what else you could have done with this team.
It's tough.
They beat the Bills in the middle of the season. By playing great defense and running the ball and having Zach Wilson throw just like a couple of key passes. And so, I mean, that's a testament to this team, or to the way that it was coached. I think as you got more and more hurt as the year went on, it just, I don't know. I'm a little worried about him because I felt pretty optimistic going into the offseason, but now I'm just a little concerned about how they're going to replace the offensive coordinator. I think the last thing we can say about the Jets is just your opinion on the release of Mike LaFleur and who they might be looking at to replace him, and we can move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. I don't know a whole lot about the situation with him internally, and I don't really follow the franchise well enough to know, but it seems like kind of a scapegoat move. And I did see the list yesterday of some of the names I had up there. I'm not the biggest Cliff Kingsbury fan, but I do think that if there's a team he's going to go to, like, I don't hate it for the Jets. I think the more we look at the situation in Arizona, the more maybe it wasn't on coaching, it was more on management than the players or coaches. But that's kind of like one name. There's not a lot of guys
that make any sense to me because it doesn't fit really. They were built on the wide zone, and their players effectively represent
his scheme is just not an NFL scheme. Like, it doesn't really like work, I think. So that's why I don't know if he's really going to get an NFL offensive coordinator job. I don't know. We'll see. The offensive coordinator thing right now for me is very interesting because I think a lot of the potential names are already head coach candidates, and it's just, I don't know that the teams that are looking for offensive coordinators are going to get the best hires unless they really try to, do their homework and find someone we don't know about yet who's actually good.
Here's the issue. You either have to hire an offensive coordinator who doesn't who doesn't have a job right now, and then why is that? Or you have to hire an offensive coordinator who doesn't have play calling ability and wants to go to the Jets, because that's the only way that you can not get blocked. Otherwise, it's a lateral move. Or you have to hire someone who's not currently a coordinator so that it's a promotion. You know what I mean? So it's like, who's that going to be? I don't know.
It is so funny. It is so funny how similar the situation in New York and Washington is. Like, it is literally the same thing. We're going to talk about it in a sec, but it is the same.
Okay. Well, that being said, let's move on to our next team here. We have the New England Patriots. Patriots. I don't even know what they want to do. I mean, they've got $44 million in cap space as it stands. So they can remake the team, but they also made a pretty substantial financial investment 2 years ago, and it was a very short run that they made. They made it to the playoffs and got knocked out immediately. This team is same thing. If they made it to the playoffs, they would have gotten knocked out immediately. The offense is not good. The defense was pretty solid. So if they are going to be a competitive team, they've got to change their offense. If they want to be a run-first team, they've got to get a better offensive line, and they have to have better receivers to at least create a threat there, which they just don't have at this point. Obviously, they need a different coach as well. I think Bill O'Brien's heavily speculated to be going there. Wouldn't be surprised if he is at all. I don't think that even Bill Belichick can justify running it back with the way that this season went. So
no.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on the Patriots as it stands?
Yeah, I just think Belichick's not the best offensive talent evaluator, and that's kind of hurt them. And I actually think these past couple months, Mac Jones showed you why he's a good quarterback to have on a rookie deal at the very least. And I think that it's just going to be structurally, how do you improve this offense? This is a team that could win 11 games next year if you do the right things. I'm just not confident that they have the managerial staff to do that, So I don't know. I mean, they need receivers. They need to, again, rebuild this offensive line. They've invested way too much in the tight end position, and these guys are not producing enough. And it's just, schematically, like they're not doing anything super special. You need an offense coordinator you really trust. Not certain Bill O'Brien really puts anything over the top at all, even with the players they might get.
Still a substantial upgrade over.
It is an upgrade, but it's tough to say that they're stuck. But I don't know that the way this team operates, unless they change a lot of like strategically what they want to do here, is in a place that they can really hit their high ends when they're in a division with the Buffalo Bills and what Miami showed year one and what the Jets have in terms of just raw talent on their roster.
Yeah, I mean, they could substantially fix this offense. They could. Without going crazy financially. They've just got to make investments at the right place.
I think
Jacoby Myers is a good player.
Mm-hmm.
Damian Harris and Ramondre Stevenson are both good players.
This has to be a DeAndre Hopkins team. Like, you have to be looking for that big weapon, because I don't think you can really push your high-end outcomes without finding a top-tier weapon for this offense with the quarterback you currently have.
I think that is a player that makes a lot of sense. I think it really does make a lot of sense, especially because it's like the volume of targets that he gets, like he can be your the receiving option, and you just run the heck out of the ball and just like feed it to him, get him 1,600 yards one more time in his career, and go. I mean, you need some depth obviously too, but that's a trade that you could probably make work. And then defensively, you'll always be pretty good. I mean, their worst defensive seasons, they've usually still been good for at least some stretch of the year. You know what I mean? Even if they start rough, they come to form, and they've got some good players there. So, this team is not that far away from being competitive. It's just they've got to fix the offense, and that's with some skill players, some slight turnover on the offensive line because it just hasn't been as good as they need it to be for the way they play. And they need new play callers, obviously. Yep. All right. Didn't even really spend time on the defense here, but you can take a look.
It's good.
If you want.
I'm confident that's going to be good because they have the coaching and they have the players that they want in there. That unit will be good under Belichick regardless.
Yeah, and they are good at scouting defensive players too. All right. Green Bay Packers set to be $20 million over the cap. Question for them is just it's Aaron Rodgers. Is he staying? Is he going? Is he retiring? If he goes, it's fairly challenging for them financially. We can talk about that next week when Kyron's back, because I want to see if he's heard anything else from his back channels. And then they have a fair assortment of draft picks. They need to fix their offensive line because it's been injured and just not even close to what they need it to be. It's great that Christian Watson has developed into a home run hitter, but they could still use some receiver help there, maybe just like a veteran, even if it's not a high paid guy, just to give you some more consistency. Alan Lazard is probably on his way out as a free agent. Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon are still good players, particularly Jones. So, really, it's just small moves, but it all depends on Rodgers. If he retires, it's easier financially, but you don't get any picks back. If he wants to be traded, harder financially, but you at least get some picks back. Defensively, they honestly should be good next year because youth, I think, was one of the problems they had. And I feel like that will be better after a full offseason because most of these guys should be back. Rasul Douglas, maybe not, but Devontae Wyatt, Kenny Clark, Jaron Reed, probably Preston Smith, Devondre Campbell, Quay Walker, Kingsley Enagbare, Rashawn Gary, Jerry Alexander, Darnell Savage. All those guys, I believe, will be back. Adrian Amos might be a cap casualty, but the majority of this team should be returning. So it'll just be more consistent coaching and some small adjustments there. But really, offensively, they need to add a little bit and find out what's going on with Rodgers.
Yeah. They just haven't. We've been banging the table for multiple off seasons now. Invested their offensive roster enough. They just haven't invested it. Like there's not enough to overcome injuries. They hope that Rodgers and coaching will get them over the hump. And obviously they lose a receiver. They have to panic, trade up for a guy in the draft, and draft another one too, and hope that works out. Eventually, I think the receiving room was decent at some point this season, but it wasn't good for sure. And then the offensive line has been really good for years, but they just had so many injuries and they kept getting older. And you kept thinking hey man, you have 5 decent starters, but behind that it's sixth rounders, and David Bakhtiari doesn't play. That guy's hurt all the time, and he's probably gonna get cut now. And maybe you should draft a tackle just to make sure you have a backup plan. And instead they just be no, we're good with Josh Neiman and we're gonna figure it out. And I don't know, they weren't set up to deal with the losses on offense, and it hurt them.
For sure. I think you can only rely on your star quarterback to upgrade the entire offense so much. If you expect them to upgrade the offensive line and pass catchers all at once, you're probably going to run into some issues. And yes, in any given game, can he do that? Yeah, he can. But I think over the stretch of a season, it's tough. And the offensive line was more injured than you expected, and we saw what happened. All right, so you have to go at 12:30, but you have something at 12:30. Can you roll right into that, or do you need time to get there?
I probably need to get there, so we got about 7 minutes probably.
All right, okay, so let's do a quick. Washington Commanders. This is your team.
Didn't commit to quarterback. It's the Jets. It's just the Jets. Didn't commit to the quarterback. They did the wrong guy. They should have traded up the first year. They should have drafted with the number 2 pick instead of Chase Young. They didn't because Dan Snyder took Dwayne Haskins. That's a whole issue on its own. I feel a little bit bad for the staff, kind of like the Jets, where it's just maybe list opportunities to go for quarterbacks. They didn't. They swung and missed on this Russell Wilson, swung and missed on Matt Stafford. Stupidly went for Carson Wentz. Didn't really get a guy this year, although Sam Howell ends up being the dude. We don't know if they're invested. And now they're just have a really good roster that, had some injuries at offensive line, need to reinvest there. They just got rid of their offensive coordinator, and it's the type of situation maybe less where he was a scapegoat and more of
Jets and Commanders should just hire each other's offensive coordinators.
Yeah, they should really. I honestly,
they both deserve coordinator jobs.
They're both good coordinators. I just think with Washington, it was the players didn't love the scheme, and Rivera and Scott Turner had some strategic differences, I think, philosophically, and it just. I think they had it. I mean, they didn't fire him. They had a parting of ways, which is the terms. It's we just didn't really want to work together anymore. And it's, I think that it dramatically in the Washington media, they're oh, he's a scapegoat. I don't know if he's really getting fired because of the problems. I think clearly they know that they have quarterback issues. They have O-line issues, and that's not on Scott Turner. But I just think
it's the same as the Jet. It really is good defensive line, quality defense. They've got depth. They've got pass rushers, they've got cover guys, they've got playmakers, offensive line and quarterback. And what else is there to say? The only difference is the ownership, really.
Yeah, the only and that's the thing is I think the staff might be gone right now if ownership was staying, but because they're selling the team, they're going to stick around for another year because they don't really want to authorize paying a new contract for a new coach. So we're going to run it back. I think they should just stick with Sam Howell and pay a bunch of go for corners and offensive line and just see what happens. And if, he beds well, and you'll have a good team next year, because I honestly don't think trading all your assets now would be well for me as a fan. If you trade a bunch of future assets for a quarterback and then you end up with a new coach who then has to deal with that quarterback and new assets, I don't love that personally. I just think it'd be same old type thing. And offensive coordinator, I don't think Frank Reich's going to get hired, but that would be my number one choice. And they said Eric Bieniemy is maybe the lead candidate. I'm not a huge fan of him either. I think he's kind of rid the coattails of what they've done in Kansas City a little bit, but
well, it would give him the opportunity to get out from under him, but we'll see. We'll talk more next week because we'll have more info on some of those jobs, whether it be head coach or coordinator positions that need to be filled.
Yeah.
But all right, Steelers. We're almost done. We've only got 2 more. The Steelers. What went wrong with them? Well,
Not
They
much
have
actually.
maybe not the best, maybe but not the best play caller, but also they just had a rookie quarterback that they wanted to give a little time to develop. And yeah, that will be a little bit rough. But guess what? Then they were good. Their defense has stars, so they can be very good. What do the Steelers need to fix? Well, left tackle and maybe a corner.
Secondary depth, yeah, maybe some more interior defensive line help, but just
Mm-hmm.
they're in a good spot. They're in a really good spot. I think they're going to be a playoff team next year, and I would even argue that this season was a success for them, even though they didn't make the playoffs.
I fully agree. I think they need to get a left tackle, which they could do with their first round pick. They can do secondary depth with one of the seconds or maybe both seconds, and then add an interior offensive lineman with their third. Rework the cap slightly. You're good to go. You'll be a good team in 2023. Congratulations, Steelers. You've done it again. Sorry.
Same, really, here.
Yeah.
Kind of. I mean, the Lions, honestly, unlucky to not be in the postseason.
In a way.
Because they're a good football team.
Yeah, I think unlucky is one way to put it. I think defensively bad is another way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. But they had injuries early in the season that cost them a big game against Minnesota that they were leading in. They lost a barn burner game against Seattle close that, again, they were really beat up in. They had their chances against Dallas. They were still beat up at that time. Really, they have a 5-game losing streak because of all these early season injuries. And then the moment they get healthy, they go, 8-2 down the stretch? It's just, I don't know. This team could have won the division if they were healthy early in the year. And, it's unfortunate they slipped up against Carolina because that's the difference, really. And, offensively, they were good enough to overcome the defensive problems, and just they were so bad on defense that it did cost them, but they got better as the year went on. Another team that I feel very good about next year where they'll be, and they can just, I think Goff played it well enough that they can just continue to develop this roster. And Dan Campbell's obviously has been proven to be a good NFL head coach, I think, at this point, and just, they're in a good spot. They have assets too. They have multiple first-round picks.
Yeah. Just let's not say, Lions Super Bowl 2023. Let's keep expectations realistic.
No.
They're in an awesome spot. It was a net win for the season. They've got 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks, and a third-round pick. So, they've got a decent amount of cap space. So this is the single most flexible team in the entire NFL based on the fact that they already have playmakers. They already have an offensive line. They already have a viable quarterback who is at the very least a transition type player. They've got their pass rusher. They need defensive help, whether it's interior defensive line, linebacker, corner. They kind of need all that, but the pass rusher is the biggest one. So how they decide to go about adding players and readjusting things, they can almost do whatever they want. They can draft a quarterback early. They can draft one later in the first. They can go after interior line. They can go after corner. They can add a couple pieces to help the defense in free agency. They've got the money for that if they so choose. They can add a safety and a linebacker with their 2 second-round picks. I mean, they really can do whatever they want, and they'll be a fun team to follow this offseason for sure.
Yeah, and Jameson Williams is effectively going to be an asset because he really didn't get to hit the ground running much at all, the way he had to return kind of on a whim and just figure things out, and they didn't really get him fully into the offense yet. I think another year with him under the current coaching staff and getting starts fresh is just going to be big for him. And that was their top asset effectively added this offseason, and I guess Aiden Hutchinson. So that was their second biggest, but it just, that could be a big addition. And then, they might have to re-sign some guys like DJ Chark, who I think actually played pretty well. It just, they're in a spot where, based on how things go in the coming weeks, their chances of winning this division are as good as anybody.
Yeah, I mean, we need to expect some regression from certain players, like Jared Goff.
Sure.
Jared Goff's probably not going to be as good next year.
I think
Jamal Williams is not going to have the season he had this year, most likely. as
The more you think about it, the more you really think maybe that they should have a long think about adding quarterback in this draft, just because the way they are structured right now, if they hit on a quarterback, they could be good for a really, really long time. Whereas if they just invest now into the roster, they could be good in the short term with Jared Goff. But the moment like that falls apart, you might be stuck where the Jets in Washington are right now. And just it would be nice to have kind of a plan at that position long term.
Yeah, I think they've managed the team pretty well since they made that transition with GM and coach, and they were better than I expected them to be this year. Their record was pretty much what I expected. I think the way that they arrived at that record is probably overall better than I thought, but they're in a good position to really hit the off season and 2023 running. All right, so we're going to get you out of here. Appreciate the time. We ran a little bit long on some of the production because Noah is traveling back to Germany this week. So Noah Ashley at Noah Ashtray Sports on Twitter. Appreciate you. And we'll see you again next week. We'll be back Saturday to pick all of the wild card games. So Saturday, that'll be 11 a.m. Eastern. And Nick, let everybody know where they can find you till we see you on Monday.
Yeah, at Nicholas Sports on Twitter. That's where most of my stuff is.
All right. At the Max Dean on Twitter. Remember, we are now Defiant Takes Football everywhere that you can find us. You can find us on Twitter, on all social media platforms. Will be Defiant Takes at Defiant Takes, and we will be launching our own site soon too. So more to come on that. We appreciate you all, and we will see you on Saturday.